You have to understand something right from the start. What we're seeing right now did not just suddenly happen. This didn't begin with a single strike, a single decision, or a single moment of aggression. What we're witnessing is the result of pressure, years of pressure, slowly building beneath the surface like tectonic plates shifting deep underground. And when that pressure finally releases, it doesn't ask for permission, it erupts. For years, the relationship between the United States, Iran, and Israel has been defined by distrust, strategic posturing, and a constant testing of limits. Not open war, but something more dangerous in many ways. A shadow conflict, cyber attacks, proxy battles, economic sanctions, intelligence operations, moves and countermoves that never quite crossed the line into full-scale confrontation, but always danced right on the edge of it. Now here's where it becomes important to shift how you think about this. Most people look at the recent strikes, the coordinated attacks on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure, and they see a beginning. But in reality, those strikes were not the start of the story. They were a signal that the rules of engagement had changed, because for a long time there was an unspoken understanding: push, but don't push too far; respond, but don't escalate beyond control; maintain tension, but avoid ignition. That understanding created a fragile balance, not peace, never peace, but a kind of controlled instability. And what we're seeing now is what happens when that control slips. You have to ask yourself what changes in the mindset of nations when they move from restraint to action, because this isn't just about missiles or military capability. This is about perception. It's about how each side interprets the intentions of the other. When one side begins to believe that the other is not just a threat, but an imminent threat, the psychology shifts. The calculus changes from should we act to can we afford not to. That's a powerful and dangerous place to be. Iran, for its part, did not respond in a limited or symbolic way. It responded broadly: missiles, drones, regional pressure points. Not just a message, but a demonstration. And that tells you something critical. This is no longer about signaling strength. This is about proving resilience, about showing that even under direct attack, they can still project power. And when both sides are trying to prove something at the same time, escalation becomes almost inevitable. Now let's take a step back and look at the deeper layer here, the philosophical layer. Conflict at this scale is rarely about a single issue. It's about identity, security, history, and fear. Nations, like individuals, carry memory. They remember past betrayals, past threats, past vulnerabilities, and those memories shape how they interpret the present. So when you see this conflict, don't just see weapons. See narratives colliding. See decades of unresolved tension finally reaching a point where words are no longer enough. And here's the part that often gets overlooked: the human tendency to believe that escalation can be controlled, that you can increase pressure just enough to achieve your objective without triggering something larger. But history has shown us again and again that once momentum builds, control becomes an illusion, because every action demands a response. Every response invites a counter-response. And before long, you're no longer deciding the pace of the conflict. The conflict is deciding it for you. This is why it's so important to understand that what we're witnessing is not random. It's not chaotic in the way it might appear. It's the predictable outcome of prolonged tension without resolution, of competition without trust, of power without communication. And when you look at it through that lens, it becomes clear. This moment was always a possibility. Maybe not the exact timing, maybe not the exact trigger, but the trajectory that was set long ago. So the real question isn't why is this happening now? The real question is what conditions made this inevitable? Because when you understand the conditions, you begin to see the pattern. And when you see the pattern, you begin to realize that this is bigger than any single strike, any single leader, any single decision. It's a system reaching its breaking point. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this. Conflicts don't explode overnight. They are built piece by piece, decision by decision, silence by silence, until one day the cost of holding back feels greater than the risk of letting go. Now, once you understand that this conflict didn't emerge out of nowhere, the next thing you have to confront is even more unsettling. It didn't stay contained. What may have started as a direct confrontation has now expanded beyond borders, beyond single targets, beyond even the original intentions of the actors involved. And this is where the nature of the conflict fundamentally changes, because a contained conflict operates within limits. It has boundaries, geographical, strategic, even psychological. The players understand the arena, and even in hostility, there's a kind of structure. But the moment a conflict spills over into multiple regions, involving multiple actors, those boundaries begin to dissolve. And when boundaries dissolve, predictability disappears with them. What we're witnessing now is not just a clash between nations. It's a ripple effect. Actions taken in one place are triggering consequences in another, often indirectly, often unpredictably. Strikes are no longer isolated. Responses are no longer symmetrical. Instead, they are dispersed, adaptive, and sometimes intentionally ambiguous. You see, when conflict expands, it invites participation, sometimes voluntary, sometimes unavoidable. Neighboring regions become staging grounds. Allied groups become active players. Strategic locations, energy routes, shipping lanes, communication networks suddenly become targets or leverage points. And this is where the stakes escalate beyond the immediate participants. Because now, you're not just dealing with military objectives. You're dealing with economic systems, global supply chains, and the fragile interdependence that holds the modern world together. Oil prices don't rise in isolation. Markets don't react in isolation. What happens in one region begins to influence livelihoods thousands of miles away. So when people say this is happening over there, they're missing the deeper truth. It's already affecting everywhere. But let's go deeper than the surface-level consequences. Let's talk about the psychology of expansion. When a conflict spreads, it creates a perception of instability that extends far beyond the battlefield, and perception in many ways is more powerful than reality. Nations begin to anticipate risk. Leaders begin to prepare for worst-case scenarios. And in that preparation, they often take preemptive actions. Moves designed to protect themselves, but which can also be interpreted as aggression by others. And now you have a chain reaction, not because everyone wants war, but because everyone fears being unprepared for it. This is what transforms a conflict into a regional crisis, not just the number of players involved, but the mindset that begins to take hold, a mindset of vigilance, of suspicion, of readiness. And once that mindset spreads, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse, because trust, once eroded at that scale, is not easily rebuilt. Now think about this for a moment. When multiple actors are involved, each with their own interests, their own fears, their own thresholds for action, coordination becomes nearly impossible. What one group sees as a defensive move, another may see as provocation. What one nation considers restraint, another may interpret as weakness. And in that environment, miscalculation becomes one of the greatest dangers. History has shown us that large-scale conflicts are rarely the result of a single deliberate decision. More often, they are the result of accumulated misunderstandings, small misreads that compound over time until they create a situation no one originally intended. And that's the risk we're facing right now, because the more this conflict spreads, the more complex it becomes. And the more complex it becomes, the harder it is to control. You're no longer dealing with a linear progression of events. You're dealing with a network of reactions, each influencing the other in real time. So when you hear about attacks in different regions, disruptions to infrastructure, rising global tension, understand that these are not isolated developments. They are interconnected pieces of a much larger system in motion. And systems, once in motion, have momentum. The question then becomes, who, if anyone, can slow it down? Who has both the influence and the willingness to step back, to de-escalate, to absorb the political cost of restraint? Because make no mistake, restraint has a cost. In the short term, it can look like vulnerability. It can be criticized, misunderstood, even rejected by those demanding immediate strength. But without restraint, escalation becomes the default path. And when escalation becomes the default, resolution becomes the exception. So what we are seeing now is not just a widening conflict, it is a shift in the very structure of how that conflict operates. From contained to connected, from predictable to uncertain, from localized to systemic. And that shift should concern all of us, because the wider the conflict spreads, the more people it touches, directly or indirectly. The more lives are disrupted, the more futures are placed in uncertainty, and the harder it becomes to find a path back to stability. So as you reflect on this, I want you to move beyond the headlines, beyond the immediate events, and see the pattern that's unfolding. Because once a conflict reaches this level of expansion, it is no longer just about who started it or who is right. It becomes about who is willing to stop it. And that is a much harder question to answer. Now, as this conflict expands and becomes more complex, there's another reality we have to face, one that challenges the way many people instinctively try to understand war. We often look for a clear winner. We want to know who is ahead, who is losing, who has the advantage. It gives us a sense of structure, a sense of clarity in something that feels chaotic. But what happens when that clarity doesn't exist? What we're seeing right now is not a clean, decisive confrontation where one side overwhelms the other and brings things to a quick conclusion. Instead, we are witnessing something far more difficult to navigate, a situation where both sides remain highly capable, highly resilient, and fully able to continue. And that changes everything, because when both sides retain strength, conflict doesn't resolve, it endures. You have to understand, modern warfare is not just about overwhelming force. It's about endurance, adaptability, and the ability to absorb pressure without collapsing. It's about how long you can sustain operations, how effectively you can respond under stress, and how well you can maintain the perception of strength even when facing setbacks. And right now, all sides involved are demonstrating exactly that. On one hand, you have advanced military capabilities, precision strikes, intelligence coordination, technological superiority being used to target infrastructure, disrupt systems, and weaken the opponent's operational capacity. These actions are strategic, calculated, and designed to create long-term advantage. But on the other hand, you have a response that is equally telling. Despite sustained pressure, there is no collapse. There is no retreat into silence. Instead, there is continued action, missiles launched, drones deployed, defenses activated, even the ability to challenge some of the most advanced military assets in the world. Now pause for a moment and think about what that means. It means that power in this context is not absolute. It is relative. It is contested. And most importantly, it is sustained. This is where the nature of the conflict shifts again, into something more grinding, more prolonged, more psychologically taxing. Because when neither side can easily overpower the other, the conflict becomes a test of endurance, a test of will. And endurance, unlike raw strength, is not always visible. It doesn't show itself in a single moment of dominance. It reveals itself over time in the ability to keep going, to keep responding, to keep adapting, even when the pressure intensifies. This is what turns conflict into a prolonged struggle. Now here's the deeper layer, the human and psychological dimension. When a conflict becomes prolonged, it begins to reshape the mindset of those involved. Urgency gives way to persistence. Quick victories become less realistic, and long-term positioning becomes the focus. And with that shift comes a dangerous normalization. What once felt shocking begins to feel expected. What once felt urgent begins to feel routine. And in that normalization, the threshold for escalation quietly rises. Because if both sides are still capable, still active, still engaged, then each new action has to be bigger, more impactful, more decisive in order to shift the balance. And that's how conflicts intensify over time, not always through sudden leaps, but through gradual increases in scale and severity. Now consider the implications of that. A prolonged conflict drains resources, economic, military, and human. It tests alliances. It strains internal stability. And perhaps most importantly, it places an ongoing psychological burden on populations who must live with uncertainty, with fear, with the constant awareness that the situation is not resolving anytime soon. And yet, despite all of that, the conflict continues. Why? Because stepping back becomes just as difficult as pushing forward. When both sides have invested heavily, strategically, politically, emotionally, withdrawal can feel like loss. And in high-stakes environments, the perception of loss can be just as significant as the reality of it. So instead of de-escalation, you often see persistence, not because it is the optimal path, but because it is the path that feels most viable in the moment. And that's the paradox of sustained conflict. It continues not only because of strength, but because of the inability to disengage without consequence. So when you hear updates, when you see reports of ongoing strikes, defenses holding, capabilities remaining intact, understand what that really signifies. It's not just activity, it's continuity. It's the continuation of a cycle that has not yet found a breaking point. And that should give us pause, because conflicts like this are not resolved through a single decisive moment. They evolve, they stretch, they demand more time, more resources, more resilience from everyone involved, and the longer they last, the more they shape the world around them. So the question we have to ask ourselves is not just who has the power to continue, but who has the courage to change the trajectory. Because sustaining a conflict proves strength, but ending one, that requires something greater. And here's the thought I want to leave you with. When both sides can keep fighting, the real victory doesn't belong to the one who lasts the longest. It belongs to the one who finds a way to stop. And when you bring all of this together, the build-up, the expansion, the sustained capability on all sides, you arrive at what may be the most important and the most difficult truth to confront. This is no longer just a conflict of actions. It is a conflict of reactions, a cycle that feeds itself. Because at this stage, escalation is no longer a choice that is made freely. It becomes a pattern that is followed almost automatically. Every move creates pressure for a response. Every response creates pressure for something greater. And over time, this cycle begins to operate with its own momentum, independent of the original intentions that started it. This is what many analysts refer to as an escalation trap. But beyond the terminology, I want you to really understand what that means on a human level. It means that decision makers are no longer simply asking, what is the best move? They are asking, what must we do now that this has happened? And that shift from choice to perceived necessity is where things become dangerous. Because when actions feel necessary, they are rarely questioned with the same depth. They are executed to maintain position, to preserve credibility, to avoid appearing weak. And in that environment, the space for reflection begins to shrink. Now think about how this plays out across multiple actors, each with their own pressures, their own audiences, their own internal dynamics. Leaders are not operating in isolation. They are responding not only to external threats, but to internal expectations, political, social, even emotional. And those internal expectations can be just as powerful as any external force. Because once a narrative takes hold of strength, of resistance, of retaliation, it becomes something that must be maintained. To step outside of that narrative requires not just strategic courage, but personal and political risk. So, the cycle continues. And while this cycle plays out at the highest levels of power, its consequences are felt most deeply at the lowest levels of vulnerability. Civilians, families, communities, people who are not making decisions but are living with the outcomes of those decisions every single day. This is the part of the conversation that often gets overshadowed by strategy and analysis. We talk about strikes, capabilities, responses, but behind every one of those words are real lives being disrupted, homes lost, futures altered, stability replaced with uncertainty, and over time the human cost does something profound. It changes how people see the world. It shapes perceptions, hardens attitudes, and in many cases plants the seeds for future conflict. Because pain, when left unresolved, does not simply disappear. It carries forward. Now here's the deeper philosophical layer. When escalation becomes the dominant pattern, it narrows the field of vision. It makes it harder to imagine alternatives, harder to consider restraint, harder to believe that a different path is even possible. And that is perhaps the most dangerous effect of all. Not just the damage being done, but the gradual loss of imagination about how to stop it. Because resolution requires something that escalation does not: intentional interruption. It requires someone, somewhere, to break the pattern, to absorb the pressure instead of passing it forward, to choose a response that does not demand an equal or greater counter-response. And let's be honest, that is incredibly difficult. It requires going against instinct, against expectation, against the very momentum that has been built over time. But without that interruption, the cycle continues. And the longer it continues, the more entrenched it becomes, the more normalized it becomes, until eventually what once felt like a crisis begins to feel like a constant. And that is not a place anyone truly wants to be. So as you reflect on everything we've discussed, I want you to hold on to this idea. Escalation is not just about increasing force, it is about decreasing options. Every step forward in conflict reduces the number of paths available to step back, and that's why understanding this moment matters. Because awareness is the first step toward change, not just at the level of leaders and nations, but at the level of individuals. How we think, how we interpret, how we engage with the world around us. Conflict on a global scale may feel distant, but the patterns that drive it, reaction, perception, fear, the need to respond, those patterns exist in all of us. And when we begin to recognize them, we begin to see that breaking cycles is not just a geopolitical challenge, it is a human one. So here's what I want to leave you with. If escalation is a pattern, then interruption is a choice. And in a world that constantly pushes toward reaction, the real power lies in the ability to pause, to question, and to choose differently. Because the future is not shaped by how conflicts begin. It is shaped by who decides they don't have to continue.